Welcome everyone to the Africa-China Initiative webinar on Africa's Railway Renaissance, the Role and Impact of China. My name is Yoonjung Park and I'm the Program Director of the Africa-China Initiative, an adjunct professor in the African Studies program here at Georgetown, as well as Executive Director of the Chinese in Africa, Africans in China Research Network. This event is hosted by the Africa-China Initiative, which is supported by both the African Studies and Asian Studies programs here at Georgetown. ACI is generously funded by the Henry Luce Foundation, and I wanted to send a special word of thanks to our program officer, Helena Kolenda, who will be retiring at the end of this year. She's been a stalwart supporter of Africa-China activities for many years, including providing a small grant to the network when we were affiliated with the Social Science Research Council. So thank you very much, Helena. We're also pleased to work with our two co-sponsors for the ACI event series, the Initiative for U.S.-China Dialogue on Global Issues and Howard University's Center for African Studies. Before I introduce our speakers, just a quick word about how this event will be running today. Each of our speakers will have about 20 minutes to make their presentations. I will then come back on screen to moderate the Q&A. If you have any questions, please put them into the Q&A tab at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And at the end of the event, we'll try to get through as many of these as possible. Finally, a quick thank you to our ACI program assistant, Brennan Young, and the U.S.-China Dialogue's Eleanor Albert. Without their assistance, these kinds of events would not take place as smoothly as they do. So to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Tim Zayantz. Tim, like many of us, wears many hats. He is a lecturer in global political economy at the University of Freiburg, a research fellow in the Center for International and Comparative Politics at Stellenbosch University, and a research associate in the Second Cold War Observatory. His research is primarily concerned with Africa's international relations and political economy, with a focus on Africa-China and Africa-EU relations, as well as on contemporary regionalisms. Tim will be followed by Padraig Carmody, who is a professor of geography at Trinity College Dublin and a senior research associate at the University of Johannesburg. He is a prolific author and has published 7 books, including The New Scramble for Africa and The Rise of the BRICS in Africa. He has edited or co-edited many others and authored dozens of journal articles. His most recent research is centered on the political economy of globalization in Africa. Finally, our last speaker will be Dr. Mandira Bagwedeen. Mandira is a senior research fellow at the Nelson Mandela School of Public Governance at the University of Cape Town. She just told us before we started that she's also been teaching a course at Stellenbosch. She focuses on Africa's regional integration and industrialization, as well as Africa-China relations. She has affiliations with various other South African universities, and works with think tanks and local and international companies in a consulting or advisory capacity, both in and outside of South Africa. So with those introductions, let me turn it over to Tim.
Thank you very much for welcoming us so warmly, and also obviously for hosting us. As I said previously, it's a pretty niche topic, I suppose, but we are very happy that you gave us the floor and the platform to talk about Africa's railway renaissance. Let me try to share my screen with all of you. It should be this one, I hope. Yes. All right. Can you see my slides now? Yes, no?
We can, but they're not in presentation mode, Tim.
They're not in presentation mode. Okay, so how do I change that?
Von begin on. I think I think it should work if you just click on it up at the top left.
Okay, I just did because I can see them in
No.
presentation mode.
Oh, you had it there.
Again, I can see it in presentation mode, but apparently you cannot. I don't know whether Brennan can come in and try to, because again, like I can see the presentation mode and can
So it's in
share it from.
presentation there now.
Was it?
It was.
Okay,
But it was
perhaps.
showing your screen as we'd see it with the notes on the next slide. You know the way it does that.
Okay, that one I might be able to change. Let me see. Is it better now?
The same. There you have it.
Yes. Okay. Okay. So yeah, thanks again for hosting us today. So I got that a huge task and probably impossible task to sort of summarize the main findings of our edited volume. And considering that the edited volume has about 270 pages, that's probably why I'd call it an impossible task. Obviously, my co-editor said, Tim, you are the right person to do that. So I'll try my best. And I'll, in the next 20 minutes, sort of, again, give you an overview of the content of the edited volume, and then go a little bit deeper into those parts of the book that I personally have contributed and researched. And then, obviously, Porrick and Mandira will take over and delve deeper into few of the issues that we have covered in our book. So generally, this railway journey started quite a few years ago. As you know, such book projects sometimes take a while, and actually this one we started still with the late Professor Ian Taylor, who, for obvious and tragic reasons, could not see the end of the project. So we started that at a time which we could describe probably at the peak of the Chinese funded railway renaissance, when some of these projects were really currently being implemented, including the Ethiopian one and the Kenyan one, both of which have come to a close now, or at least to a partial close in the Kenyan case. So this one dates back quite a few years. And what we have tried to do with this book is obviously not, so I might start by telling you what this book is not. We did not try to map all Chinese or all railway projects on the continent with Chinese participation or Chinese funding, which would have been, again, probably an impossible task considering the amount of projects that we have been seeing, and also the amount of projects that have at some point been announced and then again abandoned. So this would have been a task not to be completed. What we rather try with this book and tried with this book is to delve a little bit deeper into certain projects that have been implemented, and then also dig a little bit deeper into some contextual and more theoretical discussions that have become relevant in the context of railway projects, but not only railway, also obviously China's Belt and Road Initiative, and more general themes of China-Africa relations that we saw reflected in the context of some of these projects. I'm actually very proud, as one of the co-editors, that we did manage to assemble a book that is, in my view, an actual interdisciplinary effort. So we did not only approach people from certain disciplinary backgrounds, but in the end of the day, as you will see, I'll go through the structure of the book in a minute. We have basically insights from various disciplinary backgrounds, including history, geography, political science, also economics, sociology, I suppose. And then also we have studies and we have chapters that actually investigate Africa's railway renaissance through different methodological approaches and also different theoretical backgrounds. The main structure is sort of threefold. Obviously, there is an introduction in which we set the scene. We problematize and discuss how it actually came to Africa's railway renaissance and how it has accelerated with the help of Chinese banks and firms. We speak about what we call the convenient conjuncture of infrastructure coming back since the turn of the millennium, coming back onto the development agenda across Africa. And then the acceleration of Africa's railway renaissance, so we argue, was actually happening as a result of concerted and really intensified Chinese efforts to globalize their own railway sector and railway industry, both in construction and railway construction and civil construction, but then also when it comes to rolling stock and railway technology, which has obviously, as we know, accelerated significantly after the global financial crisis and economic developments within the Chinese economy, but also in the global economy. So we set the scene in the introduction, and then we continue basically threefold in three different segments or parts. In the first part, these are chapters 2 to 4, which you can see here on the right hand side of the slide. We basically look through different disciplinary angles at China's role in Africa's railway renaissance. We start off with a political economy contextualization, again problematizing or discussing what economic factors have accelerated the increase in projects across the African continent. We then have a chapter by Kefa Otiso. I think he's actually in the audience, if I've seen that correctly. Welcome to you as well. And by Porrick, who will speak in a minute. From a more geographic and spatial perspective, Porrick will explain about that chapter in greater detail in a bit. But what they do in a sophisticated manner is they really also look back in history and look at certain post-colonial and neo-colonial spatial legacies, particularly in East Africa and in Kenya, and how new railway projects, including the Chinese-funded railway SGR in Kenya, has sort of interacted with some of these spatial dynamics across the continent, and particularly in East Africa. But again, Porrick will say more about that. We were very happy that Professor Liu Haifang has agreed to contribute. Many of you will know her. She used to be the director of the Center for African Studies at Peking University. She has obviously been a long-term observer, a historian herself of China-Africa relations, and she has done several studies before, particularly on the Tanzania-Zambia Railway, which in many ways, as we all know, is the symbolic continues to be the symbol of China-Africa friendship, but also in many ways the prototype, the historical prototype, at least for China-Africa cooperation in the infrastructure sector. So she investigates in that chapter what she calls the Tazara spirit, to what extent it actually is still there, and how it has also changed against the background of a clear commercialization in China's overseas investments, economically speaking. So she has done interviews with various people who have been involved within Tazara over decades, both from the diplomatic side, but then also practitioners who have been with Tazara in the past. These are sort of the conceptual, contextualizing chapters. And the second part then is sort of opens the regional dynamics and dimension of Africa's railway renaissance. These are chapters 5 to 7. Mandira opens that part with what I find is a great chapter, which relates infrastructure development with broader regional development agendas across the continent, including the African Continental Free Trade Area and other initiatives at the AU level, but also at the level of the regional economic communities. And she asks the question to what extent they complement one another and where there are challenges that remain. But again, Mandira will get the chance to explain that in greater detail. Chapter 6 is sort of trying again to look at the regional dynamics more from a conceptual perspective and a theoretical perspective. I asked myself, to what extent, again, there is compatibility between the Chinese globalism and transnationalism that underlies the Belt and Road Initiative on the one hand side, and actual African regionalisms or regional integration agendas that aim at industrialization and more inward-looking economic development, and to what extent actually some of these projects might cause contradictions in that context and challenges with regard to regional integration. A third chapter focusing on the regional dimension, and I also saw Dr. Muhammad Bayane Buraima in the audience. Hi to you as well. Great that you could make it. And Professor Kiu, they shift the focus towards West Africa, and they provide a great chapter with great empirical detail about the state of the railway network in West Africa, and again, the challenges that railway integration, regional railway integration has faced in West Africa. They provide brilliant maps about existing projects, but then also about colonial projects, and they point, for instance, to one of the key problems for integration of railway networks and systems. For instance, the different gauge widths and gauge sizes, and again, with great empirical detail, they provide tables and content on the state of play in West Africa. And again, the challenge organizations like ECOWAS has been facing to integrate a railway development. And of course, current political developments in the region suggest that priorities or railway integration and infrastructure integration might currently not be the main priorities in the region, and unfortunately we see sort of regional disintegration if we wanna look at it like that. We then move to the more case study-like chapters, and again they are very dissimilar in many ways methodologically and also when it comes to level of analysis. We have several chapters that really look from a more micro level, analytical level at developments, for instance, also along the railways that have been built or even on board of the railways. And then we have more macro level studies. I'll go through them very briefly. That section is opened by chapter 8, co-authored by our colleagues Gladys Leccini, Maria Noel Dussault, and Agustina Marchetti. They look at the Nigerian case and look to what extent actually the railway project there, they call it an unfinished project, because obviously, as you know, Nigeria has planned a much longer SGR than it currently has. How they basically relate to other Chinese investments in the country along the railway route, and also in the port infrastructure in Nigeria, for example. Chapter 9 is a reprint which we could thankfully reprint, which was an article in African Studies Quarterly, and in many ways the late Professor Ian Taylor was again ahead of the curve when he authored that chapter, because he basically discusses in that article and in that chapter many of the contradictions that have arisen in the Kenyan context, starting with the opaque governance of the project, and then also the question of economic viability and to what extent the project actually will succeed in extending into the East African region. All of these dynamics are discussed in that chapter by Ian Taylor. Chapter 10 then moves towards Ethiopia, and this is in many ways methodologically an ethnographic approach. Sharon Bar-David and Lynn Schleyer have traveled that railway extensively, and they try to understand to what extent this modernist railway and development project has interacted with political dynamics within Ethiopia and the national question, as they call it in their chapter. And obviously, this is highly complex, and I wouldn't be able to summarize that in a nutshell. Suffice it to say that unfortunately, recent Ethiopian politics again, and obviously the civil war in the Tigray region, but then also the more recent hostilities in the Amhara region, in many ways, again, of course, also interact again with such development projects and with the railway. So in many ways, they set the gold standard to discuss this railway project in the context of Ethiopian politics, which are highly complex and complicated, to call it the least. Followed by a chapter on a corridor which has, since this article has been written, become very, very relevant in global politics, or at least in global geopolitics. Some of you might have heard that the US government has a keen interest to basically subsidize and incentivize investments along the Lobito corridor. For those of you who might not be familiar with that part of the continent, the Lobito corridor connects Lobito port in Angola with the Angolan hinterland and also with Katanga, all the way to Katanga province in the southern DRC. This corridor has been historically very important for the extractive industries, but it is currently very important in the context of so-called critical minerals. And again, the US government has announced that this corridor should receive funding for pilot studies to, again, extend the railway network there. The work that Anna and Regina have done there is really also brilliant in my view, because they have traveled that corridor extensively again, and have looked from the perspective of economists to look what are actually the trickle-down effects and the forward and backward linkages of that rehabilitated railway, which was rehabilitated by a Chinese state-owned firm, and the other more local economies that now profit from it, or they actually ask the question to what extent they are interlinked, and give very insightful answers in my view. Our edited volume finishes with Euler Mark's ethnography from traveling the Kenyan SGR extensively in his early months and years. And he basically identifies when talking, or identified after talking to dozens of people traveling and using the railway, he identifies various narratives that have developed around that project. He identifies, I think, 4 of them. One, of course, the SGR being a vehicle for people to a very instrumental understanding and way of speaking about it. It is also a linkage. It fulfills a linkage function, according to Lamarck and the interviewees and people he spoke to. It is also considered and described as a national symbol. So many of these projects obviously have become sort of national, highly super modern national development symbols. And lastly, Lamarck identifies a narrative around the SGR being a political tool, basically, which speaks, of course, to many of these discussions we have seen in various disciplines, actually, around infrastructure politics. And in the Kenyan case, of course, we had the presidential elections last year. Again, the SGR played again a major role. So now I gave you a little overview of the book in general. Yun, tell me briefly how many minutes I have left, because obviously I did not check the watch when I started, but probably I'm already...
Carry on.
I can carry on. Okay, so I try to fly through the next slides. And here I'll go a little bit deeper into those 2 chapters that I've authored, and again I'll do that in a nutshell. And I'm very happy to talk about some of these aspects in case someone is interested in them in greater detail. So that is chapter 2 that I'm doing, and sort of trying to explain the political economy that has facilitated the moving outwards of a lot of Chinese investments, particularly in railway. On the one hand side, and this is something that we have argued in this book, but also in other publications, also together with Prof. Carmody, in many ways, it is, of course, a result of economic developments within China. We have seen, and some of you might have seen that YouTube video. I won't play it now because of a lack of time, but we have seen, of course, China's railway sector developing over the last 2-3 decades very rapidly, and particularly, let's say, over the last 15 years. And now also particularly with regard to high-speed railways. While China had in 2008 only 60 miles of high-speed railway, by the end of the 2010s, we were at almost 39,000 kilometers of high-speed railway. Now China has the longest high-speed railway network in the world. What that means is that China has developed immense productive capacity, but also technological capacity in this sector, which has caused problems, particularly after the financial crisis. And in many ways, the Belt and Road Initiative and initial investments, also domestic investments related to the Belt and Road Initiative, have exacerbated that surplus capacity problem in these sectors. So in many ways, what the Chinese government wanted to do and has done was to try to really incentivize investments overseas in railway, but of course also in other infrastructure sectors. And in many ways, the Belt and Road Initiative has become the discursive and material centerpiece of these efforts. So the railway, the so-called railway economic belt, is really integral to the Belt and Road Initiative, and it is also very key to China's Made in China strategy, with which the Chinese state has tried to basically become a high-tech economy, and they have certainly managed in this with regard to railway technology. What we have seen domestically still in China has been a re-centralization of railway governance. I won't have time to go in there in detail. A major reason for that has actually been because a lot of railway developments in the Chinese context have suffered from corruption for a long time. And the institutional setup was considered no longer opportune, particularly with regard to trying to globalize that sector. So we have seen, which is typical for Xi Jinping's governance in many ways, we have seen a re-centralization also in the railway sector. The Ministry of Railway was dissolved in 2013, and there have been new regulatory authorities, and China Railway has basically become the state-owned monopolistic coordinator for developments of railways internally, and interestingly enough, also when it comes to the export. What we have seen with regard to the globalization of Chinese railways is at least three sets of contradictions which I discussed in that chapter 2 that I had mentioned. On the one hand side, there's been a lot of talk about the extent to which actually these projects are owned by African societies and economies and governments, and to what extent actual technology transfer is happening. Our findings suggest that this is, to this date, still actually limited. At the same time, one needs to acknowledge, and we do that in the book, there have been Chinese government efforts. And in many ways, this is also a reaction, obviously, to, we talk a lot about African agency, a reaction to African agency, because African governments and also regional integrations have demanded and insisted to have know-how transfer towards their own service staff, etc., towards engineers, etc., and African companies as well. Again, the degree remains limited, but one example of such knowledge transfer are certainly some of these transportation universities that have been put up, for instance, in Nigeria, also one in Tanzania, where Chinese firms actually try to educate the next generation of African railway engineers and technicians. So this is an example, but at the same time, it remains limited because, and this is one of the arguments that I make, there's obviously no interest on the Chinese side, against the background of what I just explained previously, to actually bring African companies or economies to a level that such high technology and railway technology could be produced in Africa. Of course, one of the Chinese rationales is to sell and to market Chinese railway construction, but also rolling stock across the continent. So it remains to be seen to what extent actual technology transfer and an increase of productive capacity in this sector is going to happen. Second set of contradiction, we have seen intensified intra-Chinese competition among Chinese civil engineering and construction firms also and particularly in the railway sector. And very often we have had alleged corruption in in the context of some of these projects. This intra-Chinese competition has also increased because there was such a strong incentivization from Beijing in the 2010s to move out these surplus capacities that I had mentioned. And that has caused actually to a cutthroat competition among some of these companies. I mentioned here a few examples where there was alleged and in sometimes court-ruled corruption involved. In the South African case, court-ruled corruption with some of the procurements done by Transnet. Tanzania's SGR in the beginning was also retendered because there was very strong competition between two Chinese firms, and there was allegedly corruption involved, which led to a retender. And then, of course, this is an issue the China-Africa community has been discussing for many years. Railway debt has been significant in some countries, Kenya being one of them, Ethiopia being another one. So this we can also, of course, discuss later in greater detail. Let me very, very briefly still mention that second chapter that I authored in that book on the regional dimension and sort of the interplay between Chinese globalism as implemented through the Belt and Road Initiative, including railway projects, and African regionalisms on the other hand side. Interestingly enough, railways and other major infrastructure have become central to both regional imaginaries, but also actual regional development plans over the last 20 years. Again, I mentioned that in my introduction. Here is a quote from the former head of the African Commission, Dlamini Zuma, herself a South African, as you know. She said, and I quote, "The African Express Railway now connects all the capitals of our former states, and indeed they will be able to crisscross and see the beauty, culture, and diversity of this cradle of humankind. The marvel of the African Express Rail is that it is not only a high-speed train with adjacent highways, but also contains pipelines of gas, oil, and water, as well as ICT, broadband cables, African ownership, integrated planning, and execution at its best." We see here, again, this, of course, a discourse at this stage, but we see how important railways and large-scale infrastructure are to regional imaginations. And Yoon, I see you came back online, so I guess I'm at the end of my clock. Do I have 2 more minutes? No?
Should probably wrap up and take questions after.
Okay, I'll do so. So what I do in that chapter again is to try to ask myself to what extent the spatial dynamics and the spatial logics that undergird the Belt and Road Initiative and some of these infrastructure projects, which is clearly a transregional spatial logic, to what extent that is actually compatible with more inward-looking regional planning, including the African Continental Free Trade area, and I'm sure Mandira will speak more about that. There have also been other controversies with regard to how China actually engages or has engaged African governments. A lot of these projects are implemented at the national level, planned, financed, and implemented at the national level, and there is limited extent to what actually regional economic communities and also the African Union is involved. So here just the headline, and I'm happy to share these quotes from some of my interviews later on. Here the headline is important. My finding and our finding has been that in many instances, infrastructure nationalism, in inverted commas, has actually trumped railway regionalism, while there are early regional plans, in some cases even master plans. In the East African case, for instance, some of these plans have actually been sidelined by national governments, also because there have been a strong competition among African governments to be somehow quicker, and East Africa's railway race has in many ways been unfortunately emblematic for that trend. I'm happy to explain more about what I think in that regard. But I spoke already for too long. Thanks for listening to that, and I'm happy to take any questions on these issues or even beyond. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Tim. Really helpful. If you can stop your screen share, we'll turn over to Parig, and I'm sure we'll have time during the Q&A to revisit kind of connections to the Belt and Road Initiative, which is very timely, as well as the kind of regionalisms versus kind of independent African countries' priorities. So with that, let me turn over to Professor Padraig Carmody.
Great, thanks very much, Yoon. And as Tim mentioned, this is a chapter co-authored with Keifa Otiso, who's in the audience, entitled Powering African Transport or Transporting Chinese Power. So really what we're interested in here is whether Chinese funded and built railways on the continent have been more developmental, or have they had power implications and impacts which are more extractivist in orientation. And the way that we kind of address this question is through historical comparison. And obviously the standard gauge railway in Kenya, many of you will know, runs roughly parallel to the old British built line to Uganda. And we start the chapter with this quote talking about how a prophet foretold the coming of the British built railway. And one of the things that's interesting in terms of the discourse around this railway was that, again, it was supposedly partly built to suppress the slave trade. And we can think about colonial discourses like that from Cecil Rhodes when he talked about colonialism as philanthropy plus a 5% return on investment. So there was an acknowledgement that there were economic motivations, but broadly speaking, it was couched in the language and discourse of mutual benefit, suppression of the slave trade, and bringing Christianity, commerce, and civilization, the so-called 3 C's, to this part of the world. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the meanings and impacts of railways. And obviously in Africa, they've been heavily associated with the colonial project. And we're all familiar with the fact that most African railways run from the coast inland to facilitate the extraction of raw materials and the import of more expensive manufactured goods. But for many people in the literature and in the policy documents recently, railways are presented as an unmitigated public good. And some of the chapters in the book kind of engage with this. And according to one African officials, governments sometimes on the continent took out loans to build things like the standard gauge railway in Kenya or the Djibouti Addis Ababa railway, knowing that they would either be unable or have difficulty repaying them. But nonetheless, there might be a logic, a social or an economic logic for doing that, not just a political logic, but sometimes it can make sense to invest in loss-making enterprises if they have broader benefits which spill out to the wider economy and society. And I'll talk a little bit about that. And largely the impacts of railways depend on the existing nature of the economy and the terms of the construction contracts. So who gets to build the railways? Where do the raw materials come from? What staff are employed? What kind of royalties and charges and other fees are attached to these, and the interest rates on the loans and so on. Okay, now I've stopped moving. And it's possible as well, of course, that these new railways, these 10,000 kilometers that have been built by Chinese companies or rehabilitated by them, are both powering transport, but also transporting Chinese power through the transfer of standards, debt contracts, and so on and so forth. Okay, so these are 2 maps from the chapter showing the railway network on the continent in 1968, the smaller black and white map there, and then showing railway gauges, including those under construction in 2017. And as you can see, there isn't that much of a difference really. The pattern looks very similar. And so this is interesting in terms of thinking about the relationship between railways and power relations that we discuss in the chapter. And railways are not just railways, but they have much broader societal impacts. And there's some interesting papers which show the connections between lines of rail and urbanization on the continent. And as you can see, most of the continent's major urban centers are on lines of rail. You can see that in the left map, and then on the right-hand side, you can see for Kenya, the biggest urban centers there, again, that kind of pattern being replicated. So the directionality, the geography, the location of these railways have much broader impacts economically, socially, and also politically by potentially connecting and disconnecting people as well. And we should remember that these are technologies of connection, but also maybe technologies of disconnection if railway stations are closed, for example, or if places are bypassed. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about colonialism versus South-South cooperation. And despite all of the kind of rhetoric of colonialism about being about the upliftment of colonized populations, primarily it was an economic project to foster capital accumulation in the colonizing countries. And in a way, then it was a spatial fix, what David Harvey calls a spatial fix for the problems of accumulation in those countries, that there was excess capital which couldn't be profitably invested, and colonialism helped release that pressure and open up new areas of the world for development or exploitation, depending on your perspective. And colonialism required governance, and railways were an important part of that. So they brought in goods and soldiers. They served political and ideological functions as well through the transport of educational materials, missionaries, and others associated or affiliated to the colonial project. And the fact that social relations were transformed by the coming of railways, I think, is captured in this phrase in Kikonga Kituba, the Bulamatari. And this was the name given to the colonial state in the Congo, the crusher of rocks, that authoritarian colonial state which was able to crush any resistance brutally. And I found out during the week as well that it also was used to refer to Henry Morton Stanley when he was using dynamite to make the road to Stanley Pool. And for that reason, sometimes railway development or penetration has been resisted. So for example, the Qing dynasty in China resisted railway construction because it would deprive us of our defensive barriers, harm our fields, and interfere with our feng shui. And kind of paraphrasing Marx, railways can serve as a battering ram to bring down what he called the Chinese walls in other places through what I've called in another piece of work, commodity power. What's commodity power? Commodity power is the idea that governance is also expressed through commodities, and the diffusion, profusion, and proliferation of Chinese commodities throughout the world strengthens not only Chinese companies, but also through the tax revenues generated, the Chinese state. So these things are mutually imbricated, even if in the Western imaginary, they're kind of firewalled off from each other. Now in the literature, and I've kind of intimated this, that there's a debate about what's the fundamental driver of Chinese interests. Is it primarily selfish economic interests, or are there more geopolitical, solidaristic kind of motivations as well, or are they mutually entwined? And one of the things that's intriguing about the Belt and Road Initiative is that it's both a geoeconomic and a geopolitical project, and these things work together in tandem, but with contradictions and blowback that we can talk about as well. Okay, Tim mentioned that statistic already. In terms of the similarities and differences between these kinds of engagements, Raphael Kaplinsky noted that in common with colonialism, Chinese engagement often bundles trade, investment, and aid under the heading of international cooperation, right? So there's no state society, oftentimes distinction made, or state private sector. There's just international cooperation that can be expressed through foreign direct investment and other vectors. Standards are a key battleground, if you want to call it that, for the future. If you can lock places into your signals standard, for example, and you know, the width of the track and the elevation of the platform and so on and so forth, then that will deepen and ensure a market for you into the future. So coming back to this issue about whether these investments are beneficial or not from a developmental point of view, well, I argue that, or we argue that, where you have highly productive economic structures, as in China or some Western countries, railways can facilitate high value exports and increase the efficiency of economic activity, yielding a high social rate of return. So even if they're not profitable in terms of a commercial logic internally, their internal rate of return, it still may make sense to have loss-making railways in that context. But where that's not the case and they're inserted into colonial style economies, they're likely to reinforce those dynamics because they bring in more competitive manufactured goods from outside and are used oftentimes to export primary commodities, which remain the continent's main exports, of course. The variety of chapters in the book talk about the fact that oftentimes it would be more efficient to rehabilitate existing rail lines, but sometimes you find governments have gone for the more expensive options, like the standard gauge railway in Kenya, which was 3 times the international cost and 4 times the original estimate to deliver. And that raises questions about kind of political opportunity structures, political business cycles, and so on. But also issues around modernity and meanings of modernity and what has been also called imperial invitations. I can talk more about that in the questions. By the same token, some people have argued that railways provide connective tissue. And for example, the SGR has revived growth in some of the old towns that had slumbered, according to Mina, due to inactivity on the old line. But there, as has been referenced previously, massive debt implications. And some people talk about Kenya having constructed a so-called do-it-yourself debt trap, where Chinese debt has assumed an outsized role, much of that associated with that railway. If you look at how the SGR is used, for every nearly 8 tons of cargo transported inland, only about 1 ton is railed back, even though this is primarily lower value, bulkier primary commodities, and the incoming traffic is manufactured goods. So again, this is recreating those relations of dependence or neocoloniality, if you want to call it that. There have also been labor impacts, but also environmental impacts. So for example, the company that built the SGR took almost 1 million cubic meters of sand from a reef off the coast of Mombasa without a permit, destroying it, undermining fisher folks' livelihood in that context. Okay. So this leads us to the question of what to do or what is to be done. Africa needs infrastructure to develop. Oftentimes governments find it too attractive to turn down, even if it has many of these negative externalities or internalities attached to it. So what do we recommend? Well, the African Union has an agenda for an integrated high-speed rail network, which is part of Agenda 2063, which was announced in 2013. I think it was a few years late maybe to be delivered. But we argue in the chapter that there needs to be greater consideration given to things like internal mobilization of resources, so that these debt traps are not created. There's a huge controversy about so-called Chinese debt traps. We're not arguing that China deliberately tries to entrap countries in debt, but nonetheless, debt is both a vector and an outcome of these relations of dependency attached to these neocolonial trade patterns and the contraction of debt and unfavorable types of investment. We talk about the need for governance reform, and we quote Karai, who talks about the fact that again, just because something is it may not be commercially viable, doesn't mean it shouldn't be done. And she talks about the Chinese railway projects upending a Western development financing model based on rule of law and high environmental standards. We can debate about this, and again, there's huge debates about, is it better to have railways or infrastructure built quickly without intensive social impact or environmental impact assessment statements, for example, and maybe we can debate that in the Q&A as well. So Africa needs infrastructure. China is able to build infrastructure, but the terms on which this relationship is founded need to be recast or rethought to make sure that there are more developmental benefits which actually flow to the continent, and that there are spillover, linkage, multiplier and accelerator effects which result from this. And that partly relates to also simultaneously developing indigenous manufacturing and local manufacturing capability to be able to contribute to this infrastructural transformation, which I think most people would agree is needed. So we conclude the chapter by arguing that Chinese funded and built railways are both powering African transport, and the passenger service on the SGR has been very popular, for example, but they are also transporting Chinese power through that variety of vectors that I've talked about during the course of the presentation. So I will leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Padraig, and less than the allocated time. So
Yeah.
depending on how Mandira does, so we might have a good amount of time for Q&A. So let me turn it over to you, Mandira.
Sure. Thanks, Yoon, and thanks for inviting us to chat about our book. It was quite a journey, and we've definitely, learned quite a bit about the state of railways in Africa and Chinese interests in building railways in the continent. So my chapter, let me just, before I start, share the screen with you. Okay. Just going. Okay, so the title of my chapter in the book is Chinese Railways and African Developing Railways, or Railing Development. And I must give Tim credit for this title. I was trying to, think of a title, and he came up, he's like, why don't you use this? So credit goes to Tim for the title. Okay, so the chapter, it is quite a dense chapter, and it does bring out various themes and points. The chapter, it definitely highlights the vital role of railways in achieving Africa's infrastructural ambitions, its regional integration ambitions, its trade ambitions, and its industrial ambitions. So it definitely doesn't, contest the role of railways or the importance of railways in achieving Agenda 2063 and actualizing the AFCFTA. But I don't want to go into that too much. It's a bit context heavy. I thought it would be a good idea to kind of pull out the main points of the chapter and go through each of the 3 points with you. I will try, definitely. I have been watching the time, so I will try to be as concise as possible. And, if there's anything that you need more clarity on, we can discuss it in the Q&A. So the chapter, firstly, it situates Chinese railway projects, especially looking at the Kenyan and Ethiopian Djibouti SGRs within the institutional and pragmatic landscape of railway planning and development in Africa. Then it goes on to look at Africa's railway renaissance, and it discusses this conundrum that I kind of found in some of the literature. And this is looking at, should African countries develop brand new railway lines, so that's greenfield infrastructure, to SGR specifications, or should they modernize and expand existing railway networks, brownfield infrastructure? So that's already railway networks that they have from their colonial past. And then the third point, I think one of the most important points of the chapter is it stresses the importance of railway economics and sound feasibilities after kind of assessing the performance of the Kenyan and Ethiopia Djibouti SGR post inauguration. So let's look at the first point. I will go a bit briefly through this because the crux of the presentation of the chapter is really around the last 2 points. So when you look at Africa's kind of rail institutions or rail sector or kind of systems, let's say that, there definitely isn't like, we couldn't find one, like we couldn't say, okay, there's one organization that's like responsible or kind of pioneering railway planning and development across the region. So at present, there are several organizations that oversee the coordination and promotion of railway policies across the continent. And this includes continental, regional, and international organizations. I'll just drop a few names. This is it's the African Development Bank, NEPAD, the Union of African Railways, and the International, I think it's the International Railways Association as well. Oh, the International Union of Railways. I just checked my notes. So there's really no kind of authority serving as a gatekeeper or filter around, what type of foreign investments are allowed, what type of railway standards can be kind of exported to the continent, what type of systems. So we've already seen that there's the Turkish suppliers, there's Chinese suppliers, European suppliers as well involved. So, there is this risk that the railway could just become, the continental railway network could just become another like patchwork of railways. But what I did find in the research was it seems that there is some kind of railway blueprint or plan, and that comes in the form of PIDA, which is being driven by this is the program for infrastructure development in Africa. I think, Tim, you can correct me with the acronym if I've got it wrong. And it's a blueprint basically for developing infrastructure in various sectors. That's roads, railways, airports, and ports. And railways definitely do play a role, and PIDA acknowledges the importance of railways and various, in kind of developing various trade and transport corridors. And so largely like Porrick showed, the railway network in Africa really does still have this, it's kind of like this patchwork type of network. And we're lacking harmonized railway systems, standards, and regulations. But there is some hope. In 2022, the AU Executive Council adopted technical specifications for the African railway network, related norms and standards, and the roadmap towards developing the African Common Market of Railways. So hopefully in the next few months and years, we're likely to see more kind of standardized policies and things and rail standards being adopted either across the region or at least regional blocks setting up their own terms, so to speak. Okay, so the next slide is going to give a brief overview of railway economics, and especially railway economics relate in the context, in kind of the African context. So a railway project's financial feasibility lies in the challenge of covering massive infrastructure costs and achieving the necessary traffic density to ensure profitability. And rail traffic densities, that's both freight and amount of passengers on the continent, are much lower than in many other regions of the world. And this is a significant constraint for developing railways in the region, because you need high volumes and you need trains to be traveling quite frequently to secure kind of operational sustainability of a railway. And so because of this low traffic density and the cost of operations for railway transport services in Africa, it's quite expensive to run a railway in the region. And in many cases, it's just not competitive against other forms of transport, especially road transport. And in most cases, when considering railway developments, the competition between road and rail transport infrastructure is not carefully considered, and that can lead to incorrect traffic forecasts, and this would definitely impact, assessments around the feasibility of a railway. And most of the railways, at least railways that are generating a little bit more or making a little bit more of an income, are geared more towards the transportation of cargo, and this can be definitely scaled up and be more profitable if the cargo side of the railways is efficiently operated and managed. So just around the debate of whether to go with greenfield developments or with brownfield developments. So greenfield developments are costlier and face a higher level of market risk due to uncertainty concerning future demand. But on the other hand, brownfield infrastructure developments are more suitable when constructing a new railway line is too risky, or for investors, or when massive upfront investments are not available, as is generally the case in most regions across the continent. And at the end of the day, whether you're going with a brownfield investment or greenfield investment, economies of scale play a very important role in determining the project's viability. It really does come down to, the larger the volume of freight and passengers served, the greater the likelihood of a railway successfully operating commercially. So keeping this in mind, this kind of greenfield versus brownfield kind of debate, keep that in mind, because what we're seeing is, or what emerged in 2016 was kind of this directive from the African Union in the form of its white paper, the 2016 white paper on transport. It was titled, the 2016 AU White Paper on Transport Policy Framework. And it stipulated that all new railway lines should be constructed to standard gauge, and upgraded railway lines should move to standard gauge. And if this is not possible in the short term, measures should be taken to ensure that the track bed can accommodate standard gauge in the future. And it didn't explicitly say why it was pushing for standard gauge, but the fact that the average speed's better on a standard gauge, you can carry a bit more cargo, actually I think quite a bit more cargo, and that solutions can be purchased from a wider market is likely to have influenced the organization's decision. But just comparing the cost of building standard gauges to that of a meter gauge, it's really, really, really expensive. And so this is definitely financially risky for African countries, especially poor performing economies and those dealing with debt stress. And understandably, African states, we are aspiring to high development levels. We definitely want access to premium technology to hasten or jumpstart our development. But when I was chatting with some transport specialists about, you know, this debate, greenfield versus brownfield, they said, a lot of them said, you know, this idea about industrialization and modern technology is a bit misguided, and especially around with railways, the use of standard gauge. And it's because it's often equated with modern and effectively operated. But the main idea, or how a railway is run and managed and how it's operated, will really be the main kind of determinants of whether it's a well-performing or good performing railway. You know, and you can have the latest technology, but if it's not well managed, well run, well governed, it's really gonna not bring in much income. So let's just take a brief look here at the Kenya, Ethiopia, and Djibouti case, their SGRs, and, you know, questioning, you know, they kind of defying railway economics. And so can this be considered a costly mistake? Keeping in mind, again, just at the back of your minds, keep the greenfield versus brownfield debate, feasibility, economic viability, let's say points at the back of your mind. So I've quickly I put together a brief table comparing the specs and who was involved in developing the railways, the costs and things. I think I pay attention to the cost as well as electrification and freight volumes. So in my research, I came across 3 reports that recommended that the investment in greenfield SGR is very, very costly, and the more feasible option would be to update brownfield infrastructure or invest in developing rail links to be consistent to the gauge network that they would connect to. So, for example, looking at East Africa, if you are maybe a country that East Africa may want to connect with Central Africa, Southern Africa, and possibly parts of North Africa. So depending on where the borders are, it might be that you want to develop railways in countries that border those regions with the gauge that will connect with that region. So the three reports are the CPCS Transcom East African Community Railway Master Plan Study. The other one is the World Bank, the Economics of Railway Gauge in the East Africa Community, and the most recent one I could find was in 2015 by the African Development Bank, titled Rail Infrastructure in Africa Financing Policy Options. And as you can see, I've picked out various points or quotes from these 3 reports that kind of nudge you or push you more towards thinking about investing instead in brownfield infrastructure. So we know that both these railways, the Kenyan and Addis Ababa Djibouti SGRs, cost a lot of money. We know that Kenya and Ethiopia are both developing countries. We know that both have, serious debt issues, not just with repaying Chinese loans, but also with repaying their Western debt as well. And we know that, in terms of industrialization, in terms of really having a vibrant economy, they're not very high up on the scale. And if you look at the freight volumes, they really aren't where they need to be to justify building an SGR line, which for it to be like commercially viable, should be transporting 20 to 25 million tons a year. But as Parik mentioned, we can't ignore the kind of the social impacts or the social pros of developing these railways. They've definitely reduced travel times. They've improved people's mobility. One of the chapters looks at how traders really rely I think it was the Bungeela Railway, really rely on it to move their goods. And also, there's been this kind of revival of economic activity along these lines. But I think to my knowledge, and I may have missed the news if something's popped up, but so far the governments are not subsidizing these railways. So, they really are depending on these railways being commercially viable and profitable to repay loans, to cover maintenance costs and operation costs. But, it might be quite challenging for railways to kind of reach the desired income that's required, because they're operating in a market dominated by trucking. Both countries have very big trucking industries. In fact, in Kenya, there was issues around how do we split the cargo between the trucking industry and the railway. In Kenya, they building the railway. This railway has to compete with the old meter gauge railway and a new highway that was built. So where's this, this freight traffic? How are we going to get more freight traffic onto these rails? And there's also, I think, what Tim and we spoke about in a podcast with the China Global South Project, is that there seems to be not enough auxiliary infrastructure and industry to support the commercial viability of the railways. There's been this kind of slow development. We're seeing things like, special economic zones and things trying to be set up closer to these railways, but it's really moving at quite a slow pace. And you basically need industry around the railway to put cargo on the rails to get the freight volumes up, to get profit. And so without government subsidies, it's really going to be challenging for the railways to break even, cover their costs and repay their loans. So just some concluding points is that, considering that East Africa has one of the lowest traffic densities in the world, decisions to build SGRs, let alone electrify one, it just seems very difficult to justify. And now we're seeing that the three countries are faced with the conundrum of how to ensure the new railways can at the very least break even over the short to medium term. And I think instead of the railway lines serving as symbols of economic prosperity and instruments of regional integration, they serve as a lesson to both China and African states to be a bit more prudent in their rail endeavors. And these two cases, I think, really stress the importance of ensuring, due diligence, sound feasibility studies, and factoring in rail economics. And the late Professor Ian Taylor's chapter also, he takes this point a bit further in his chapter, so it's worth reading his chapter as well. And there's definitely a pressing need to establish African railway standards, systems, and regulations, either at a continental or regional level, especially with all this kind of foreign interest in the railway sector. There's a need for us to be gatekeepers and say, okay, this is what's allowed, this is what won't be allowed, or this is what will work, and this is what won't work. So I'll leave it at that, and I'll take questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mandira. If I can have you stop sharing your screen and have the other speakers turn on their cameras, that would be great. It looks like Tim answered a couple of the questions already, but let me go ahead and ask them aloud in case any of the other speakers want to kind of contribute. And then I see there maybe one additional question. We have about 15 minutes And I think what I'd like to do is go through all of the questions that are up at the moment. Maybe interject one or two of my own to take advantage of my position as moderator, and then go around and do just kind of a final round. So Tim, Parig, and then Mandira, so that we can just close out that way. I'll come back at the very end. But Joel Adota, hi Joel, who stays up very late in Australia or New Zealand in Canberra to join us for these. Asked, do you know of any African countries are planning to use maglev technology in HSR development? I trust that you guys know what that means, because I certainly don't. And then why do you think Uganda failed to secure funding for its portion of the SGR? And then Yabo Wu asked, since you mentioned global regional dialectics, I wonder if you can share more of your thoughts about the difference in seeing railway construction within a national border and within a region that has several countries. And more importantly, do these differences inform Chinese engagement? So those two. And then Yang Shao sends greetings from Trinity College Dublin, and writes, since you touched on the geopolitical ambitions of transportation project, can you please elaborate whether China's BRI or AIIB are helping it to exert soft power as a public goods provider with morality and challenge the legitimacy of US global leadership? So those are the questions we have from the audience. I wanted to give all of you an opportunity to maybe touch a little bit more on the linkages between Africa's railway renaissance, as you put it, and China's Belt and Road Initiative. My question really is, in the last few years, certainly with kind of challenges of China's own economy, the signaling in the most recent BRI summit has been that they're going to go smaller. So what kind of impacts do you see this having on Africa's railway projects? And it seems clear to me that, additional focus on smaller projects, on digital projects, and their kind of green projects all kind of run counter to the idea of funding big railway or dam projects in Africa. So I wanted to leave you with that. So let me turn it back, and maybe if we can go in the same order that we did the presentations. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Yun. And thanks for those very, very interesting, intriguing questions, actually all of them. I think the first one I answered already partly. So with regard to magnetic levitation train technology, that's far from where we are at technologically. To my knowledge, only China, Japan, and South Korea uses that technology currently. And my interviewees have confirmed, and that we also see when we look at the SGRs, also the greenfield SGRs, none of them actually even lives up, in inverted commas, to the China standard, which is, as you know, or as the person who posed the question, which is an integrated model of different technological standards. None of them actually lives up to that China standard. Also, in terms of, like, the easiest way to see that is in terms of speeds. Most of them have 140 or 160 kilometers per hour, and not higher. So narrowly defined, they are not even high-speed railways. And the reason for that is simple. My interviewee said that the demands on sites, on the African side, are to bring in high-speed railway broadly defined. So put it simply, faster and more reliable railway technology. The greenfield projects, the rail beds would allow for an upgrade to a HSR later, narrowly defined, But currently, these projects are in many ways also by China Exim Banks and by the firms that are involved, including China Railway. They are adapted to local demands, and these local demands simply very often relate to how much money is available to be invested. So we are far away from some of these technologies, and certainly far away from magnetic levitation trains. So the second part of your question, which is of course also intriguing and mostly political and well also economic, I guess. Why Uganda hasn't managed to secure a loan from China Exim Bank? In many ways, unfortunately, the timing for Kampala was they were a bit too late for the Chinese-funded part of the African railway renaissance. When they actually entered advanced discussions with Kampala, that was already when some of these other projects across the continent, but not only in Africa, Sri Lanka was another example, obviously with a port there, were entering a troublesome period in terms of repayment and sovereign debt. So the China Exim Bank, as we argue in other publications, the China Exim Bank as of 2017 has become much more restrictive in what projects they would actually fund. And unfortunately, even though there was a deal signed in 2015 already, or at least a memorandum of understanding, those later negotiations with China Exim Bank and between China Exim Bank and Kampala fell into that time period when China Exim Bank, for both economic and political reasons, remember that backlash, that political backlash that arose also in neighboring Kenya. And as a result, in many ways, this is why China Exim Bank decided not to fund it hitherto. As you know, they have negotiated now a memorandum of understanding with a Turkish firm supported by Turkish development aid. We'll see whether this materializes. One key aspect there is, and here I might come to the other question about the regional dimension. One key aspect for any financier there is, does the Kenyan railway actually reach the border? Because only if the Kenyan SGR reaches the border, we do have the old meter gauge having been rehabilitated between Naivasha and the Ugandan border, but only it makes economic sense only if we have basically a seamless, uninterrupted SGR reaching Uganda for a financier to make a bankable project out of that. And that applies to a Chinese financier, especially now after what I've mentioned, but that also applies to any other private bank that might get, or a private investor that might get involved. So I hope that answers the question partly. I do remember the second point with the geopolitics of infrastructure, spot on question, and obviously very, very, very relevant. In many ways, China has had a free rein in inverted commas for a long time in Africa's infrastructure sectors and pretty much across the board. And the reason has been because there was simply limited Western funding. Of course, the multilateral development banks have funded, but governments or the EU, leave alone the American government, they were very hesitant to fund infrastructure for quite a long time, except for Obama's Power Africa initiative, which was a failure, essentially. So for a long time, actually, it was China setting the standards, and with the Belt and Road certainly setting the standards. And your question obviously alludes to that intensifying geopolitical and geo-economic competition that we are currently experiencing, which plays out not least in the infrastructure sector, with the US government having come up with their own initiative, Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment, which is sort of a G7 initiative, but actually US driven, and the European Union having come up with a Global Gateway initiative. So we do see that there is more and more competition there, and I always say it can be a curse or a blessing for African governments. On the one hand side, we have a growing number of actors, and by the way, also Japan is coming back big time with JICA to develop infrastructure as well. The South Koreans are coming in some infrastructural sector. So this rally around, or this race to build African infrastructure, can be a blessing because there are more sources for finance. On the other hand side, it can also be a curse because it might undermine, and this is where I will close, it might undermine again a common regionally coordinated African approach and planning towards infrastructure. And this is quite clearly what Mandira has also nicely explained. This is what is paramount in the context of all these projects. It does not suffice to have on paper PIDA, as Mandira mentioned, that Program for Infrastructure Development for Africa, which is the AU initiative, or to have on paper some regional infrastructure plans. Some of my interviewees, practitioners in the railway sector, they said this regional approach must be taken to the negotiation tables with funders. It must be taken to the question of how do we design these projects. And this is where I think problems have arisen in the past, that there are these lofty regional infrastructure plans, but when it comes to the implementation, national governments sort of are eager to decide in national capitals. And we see that across the board, actually, not only in infrastructure. And this has caused all kinds of problems because now, just an example, and Porrick mentioned that already, in the East African region, even though we had an initial railway master plan, we basically have different technological standards now on these two standard gauge railways along the northern corridor and along the central corridor through Tanzania. Of course, the idea is to integrate these systems, but you have different platform heights, you have different axle load limitations. So we see already what I call these national infrastructural nationalism, where this has brought us. It has brought us to what two of our authors have called railway patchworks across the continent. But I'll stop there. I pass the ball to Porrick.
Okay, thanks, Tim. So I think you've covered most of the questions there. So maybe I'll integrate some of the questions. And you were asking about the kind of downscaling, reorientation, and that kind of links to the soft power question as well, and also to the question about Uganda and why it wasn't successful in getting funding. So my perspective on it is the BRI is now embedded in China's constitution. It's Xi Jinping's signal foreign policy, and it can't be allowed to fail. But it has certainly generated intense contradictions. The nature of the international interconnections that it has generated have generated these intense contradictions, some of which we've talked about, that have to be addressed. And there's been geopolitical blowback, pushback and fallout attached to issues around debt, particularly in the context of COVID, the fact that most Chinese lending takes place on a commercial basis, sometimes at higher interest rates than you might find from other lenders. If you look, for example, at Zambia, Zambia cut a debt deal there through the G20 or 21 now. But in those negotiations, China took a very tough negotiating stance where it insisted that the debt to the Chinese Export-Import Bank that Zambia owed, which is in the billions of dollars, be classified as commercial rather than public debt. And what that meant was that they were able to escape the restructuring deal that was imposed on the public lenders. So some people have argued China is a very commercially savvy lender. It is not quick to write down debt. But yet there is this geopolitical pushback, blowback, which actually undermines China's soft power. And as you mentioned, Yoon, China is struggling economically now. There's a 22% youth unemployment rate. Xi Jinping is encouraging the youth to eat bitterness, as their forebears did, for example. So this, to me, suggests a reconfiguration of the BRI, a downscaling, a greening, a shift to small-scale projects, which are potentially more bankable or will generate less negative publicity if and when they do fail. So, and it suggests to me that China is looking at alternative avenues and vectors of influence. And in particular, the kind of bolstering of political alliances and networks, some of which have been fostered through the BRI, because these projects have been supply driven and demand led by African political elites mostly. They've requested them in many instances. And I think what China is doing is it's looking at other ways to bolster its economy and to exercise influence through things like the BRICS expansion. And if you look at the BRICS expansion, it was interesting that 3 major oil producers, or Iran, which is not a major producer but has major reserves, were included, and that they're de-dollarizing the trade between some of the countries in the BRICS. So the UAE and India are now conducting their trade through their national currencies, and a lot of that is in oil. And that oil is the most imported traded commodity in the world. It's 10 times bigger, $2 trillion market, 10 times bigger than all metals trade combined. And if you're able to de-dollarize the oil market, that undermines US power geopolitically and economically. So to me, we see this kind of competitive alliance formation. Tim talked a bit about these competing infrastructure initiatives, but these are all part of the same geoeconomic, geopolitical competition. So I'll leave it there. Thanks. You're on mute, Ian.
I imagine the expansion of BRICS as well, that happened recently, plays into what you were just talking about, Padraig. Okay, Mandira, last few minutes are yours.
Sure, I'll keep it short. My colleagues have definitely, given a very comprehensive and nuanced answers. But I think just to speak more to, the Chinese preference for small and beautiful projects and what that will have on developing, what impact that will have on developing railway projects in the region. So I think we should keep in mind that a lot of Chinese railway projects are still being constructed. There's still quite a few that actually need to be completed. So I think in the next few years, we'll see more kind of Chinese railways being completed and actually running. And then I think FOCAC, at the last FOCAC, they indicated this preference now of lending to regional banks instead of, they might be diverting from bilateral lending and lending more towards regional banks like the AFDB. So I think that railway projects could still be kind of considered, but possibly you'd see maybe because the money will be going to regional development banks, they'll play a larger role in determining, okay, whether they will finance the railway. So we could see more kind of a more kind of prominent role of regional banks in the railway development. But you'd still be accessing Chinese finance, but just coming through the regional banks. Yeah.
To your last point, one of the other questions that I had kind of noted down to myself was whether or not it's too early to start talking about whether or not some of these railroad projects are successful, right? Given that so many are still under construction, and the other linkage that you mentioned earlier in terms of auxiliary infrastructure as well as industrial policies within Africa to kind of, do we need another 10 years to kind of reevaluate? So maybe it's time for you guys to start thinking about the next
another book. Yeah, no, you definitely. I do think it's a bit early to kind of jump the gun and say that. That's why I kind of put a caveat and say in the short to medium term. And a lot of some of the people I interviewed said, you know what, you got to give it at least a couple more decades to prove it worth. But the kind of catch with that is that, okay, you still have to maintain, operate, and run the railway, and that's still very expensive, and without government subsidies. So, it's still like a standard gauge. It's still really difficult. But I do think from a social kind of impact, they definitely do have or have had an impact in the like post-inauguration. I've had colleagues in Kenya say it's like great, it reduces travel time, and just also the scenery through the Kenyan route. It's quite beautiful. So
yeah. Well, I want to thank all of you again. I'm kind of wish we could have done like an entire day and heard from all of the contributors. I think especially the case studies as well as the historical kind of element. Certainly railways in terms of Africa-China engagement are not only hugely impactful, but symbolic in terms of the connections between China and the continent. So congratulations again on a very timely publication of this book on this topic. Thank you all again for participating. Thank you to our audience for being here. We have one more ACI event that we're co-sponsoring with the US-China Dialogue that will focus on China's GDI and other kind of multilateral kind of programs and kind of how they link with Belt and Road Initiative. And that's coming up in November. We've circulated a flyer to that end, but you can find more information about that and you can click to register for that project on the US-China Dialogue website. Thank you again for participating in this event and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Ian. Bye.
Thank you.